The Sibyls are probably best known from the Cumaean Sibyl, who's featured in the Aeneid. There's this episode in Book 6 where Aeneas arrives in Italy and he needs to figure out what his next steps are. And so he goes to visit this temple, this shrine in Cumae, and he sees this woman who we call the Sibyl. Aeneas is a soldier and a refugee. He's not a religious authority. All he knows is that he's been having these visions and dreams, and recently a vision appeared to him of the ghost of his recently dead father, Anchises, who told him that he needs to visit him to get some information. But the problem is that Anchises is dead and resides in the underworld. In order to get to the underworld, Aeneas needs a little bit of guidance, and that's where the Sibyl comes in. This is where we meet Aeneas in the beginning of Book 6 of the Aeneid, with his arrival at Cumae. So I'm going to read to you a little bit from Stanley Lombardo's translation. I'll link this down below. This is the translation that I would recommend. So this is from the opening of Book 6. But Aeneas, on a mission of his own, sought the high holy places of Apollo, and the Sibyl's deeps, the immense caverns, where the prophetic god from Delos breathes into her mind and soul and opens the future. The Sibyl of Cumae guides Aeneas on his journey down to the underworld. She's with him for most of Book 6, and she lets him know all of this information that he otherwise would not have had access to. She and the other Sibyls from antiquity are the subject of today's video. I want to thank Nathan00G for this request. I love this topic. This is something that I've been spending a lot of time thinking about. Divination, prophecy, prophetic figures like the Sibyls. There's so much to talk about, so let's get into it. Hey friends, welcome and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, my name is Kate. This is Hearth of Haemonia, and we're here to discover and unpack the beliefs held by ancient Greek and Roman people, and sometimes their neighbors. We dig into everything, from mythology to magical practice, philosophy, and all those related subjects. If this kind of thing appeals to you, feel free to subscribe. And if you have any thoughts about today's topic, I invite you to share them in the comments. My comment section is very friendly, and many thanks for that. You may think of the Sibyl as a Roman priesthood, especially if your exposure to them comes from Virgil. But actually, the Sibyls were originally a Greek priesthood, and actually their name as we have it comes from ancient Greek, although Pausanias has this line about how that even might come from Libya. This priesthood is ancient. So ancient, in fact, that the Greeks who were writing about it didn't really know where it came from. The important thing to note is that the Sibyl is not just one person. It's a title, a religious title that referred to different priestesses with prophetic abilities located at different prophetic temples throughout Greek and Roman territory. A very late source, Lactantius, who is an advisor to Constantine I, lists 10 Sibyls. And actually some of the Renaissance art that we have depicting these figures shows more than one. So here on the screen you have Raphael's painting, which is just called The Sibyls. And then here are some from Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel. Typically, the Sibyls were just named based on the temple that they were attached to. So the Sibyl of Delphi, the Sibyl of Dodona, the Sibyl of Cumae, and their personal names are not always recorded. We have a couple, but for the most part, they're just referred to as the Sibyl. Their own self is less important than the work that they do. And we'll see kind of why that is as we go through what it meant to be a Sibyl and their identity and how all of that works together. Their job was to deliver prophecies to those who sought them out. So these would have been religious officials that would have been officially petitioned by people wanting to get an oracle for themselves or having a question that they wanted answered or addressed. They would submit the question to the Sibyl, and then the Sibyl would respond. Like all prophecy in antiquity, the Sibyl's proclamations were famously obscure. A cynical view might be that if they're obscure, then they're never really wrong. But the less cynical view is that the god works in mysterious ways. And so the divine speech that is coming from these prophetesses is not going to necessarily make sense until you sit down and think about it. Now, what is prophecy? This is a very complicated question, one that I've been spending a long time thinking about, but I'm going to try and distill some ideas about it here. This is in no way comprehensive. Prophetic speech is divine speech. It's speech of the gods. It's the thoughts and the knowledge and the opinions of the gods that is translated for human ears. Humans can't understand the gods in their own words, and they can't interact with the gods directly. So they need these sort of intermediary figures to translate for human ears. And that's where prophets come in. The Sibyls, the Pythia of Delphi, which takes over, and then in mythology, figures like Cassandra and Tiresias. An analog to this would be the passage in Exodus where Moses has gone up to the mountain to talk to God, and God delivers the tablets with the commandments, which Moses then relates to the people. Moses is the only one that is allowed to interact with God directly. The passage of Exodus reads like this. So Moses went up on the mountain, and the cloud covered it. The glory of the Lord settled on Mount Sinai. For 6 days the cloud covered it, and on the 7th day the Lord called to Moses from inside the cloud. To the Israelites, the glory of the Lord looked like a raging fire on top of the mountain. Moses entered the cloud as he went up the mountain. He stayed on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. Moses is this intermediary figure where he interfaces with the god directly. The god delivers some kind of information or insight to Moses, which Moses then brings to the people because the people themselves can't interact with God directly. This mediating role that Moses plays is very similar to the role of the Sibyls. The Sibyls are, in effect, the mouthpieces of the gods. And prophecy can come from pretty much any god, but the gods that are really directly dealing with prophecy are gods like Apollo and, to a lesser extent, Helios. Both sun gods, incidentally, maybe because the sun sheds light on things. An idea that Helios is the all-seeing sun. So they have this kind of superior knowledge. So they're the gods that deal primarily with prophecy. So prophets, like the Sibyls, are priestesses of these prophetic gods, Apollo, and so on. Now, Apollo is not just a god of prophecy, he's also a god of music, and several other things that are unrelated. It's true that bards, like Hesiod and Homer, Hesiod in particular, spend a lot of time talking about their relationship to divine speech, and the songs of the bards are supposed to be inspired in a similar but not exactly the same kind of way as the prophets. So we'll see as we go exactly how the prophet interacts with the god in these moments of direct interaction. The nonfiction accounts that we have of prophecy are usually in reference to a prophet that is attached to a temple. So in our case, the Sibyls, elsewhere the Pythias, and so on. In those accounts, we don't actually see this moment of interaction because it usually goes something like this. A querent seeking an answer to a question will go to one of these temples of prophecy, Delphi, Dodona, and submit a question to the priestess. Typically, there will be even more intermediaries, other priests who work at the temple who will receive the question, deliver it to the priestess. I'm thinking of the Pythia here specifically. And then the priestess does her thing, which is not typically reported, and then the answer comes back and is delivered to the querent, usually by someone else. And as I said, they're typically vague answers, and the querent will usually walk away more confused than ever after, of course, making a donation to the temple. In these kinds of accounts, the interaction between the seer and the god are not described. In poetry and storytelling, more broadly speaking, we as the audience are actually invited into the conversation between the prophet, the seer, the oracle, and the divine. And we also get to see what these intermediary figures are like. They're not typical. Because prophecy is this superhuman thing, and because divine speech is so far removed from human speech, the intermediaries who are interacting directly with the god, they have something about them that is not quite right, or some sort of symbolic sacrifice, if you want. Like Tiresias, for example, one of the most famous prophets from ancient fiction, he's famously blind, and Homer is reported to be blind as well. The idea is that Tiresias has given up his human sight in order to receive true sight, real, true understanding of how things work, and access to this special knowledge. There's also an idea that maybe these liminal figures are a little bit mad. Maybe they're a little bit crazy. The way that their interaction with the gods is depicted is sometimes to show them in a frenzied state, almost possessed. We'll see some examples of that, especially as we read more from the Aeneid. But there's this cool passage in Plutarch. Actually, the entire work is pretty cool. I'll link it down below. We'll have to talk more about that at a later date. Essentially, this is a dialogue where friends are discussing some of the specifics of oracles and how they're delivered to people. And at one point, he has this quote about the Sibyl, where he says, "But the Sibyl, with frenzied lips as Heraclitus has it, uttering words mirthless, unembellished, unperfumed, yet reaches to 1,000 years with her voice through the god." So she speaks, at least according to Heraclitus, with frenzied lips. She's in an altered state somehow. And this is how you end up with theories about, like, maybe the Pythia was on drugs, maybe the Pythia was inhaling, hallucinogenic gases. That's not the topic of today's video, so I'm not going to get into that, but this idea that they're somehow not quite right. And like I said, we'll see more of that. There's a lot more to say about prophecy and the nature of prophecy, but suffice it to say that these intermediaries are liminal figures. They're not quite people, although they are people. They're mortal, they're human, and yet somehow they're beyond that. They have this air of mystery around them. They're set apart by the work that they do. I want to turn now to two of the temples from antiquity that had Sibyls attached to them, Delphi and Cumae. Cumae we've already talked about, and we'll come back to it. It's maybe the most famous temple where there was a Sibyl, or maybe the temple most famous for its Sibyl. But Delphi is allegedly where the Sibyl originally started practicing. So let's take a look at Delphi first. Delphi is one of the major sites of prophecy in the ancient world, arguably the most well-known and perhaps the most important. There were other sites, like Dodona is another one, huge in the Greek world, that also had a Sibyl. Delphi was best known as a sanctuary for the god Apollo. This may not have been its original function, but its heyday of power and authority really was under Apollo and his priests and priestesses. one such priestess being the Sibyl. And by the way, the Sibyl is apparently the precursor to the probably better known Pythia of Delphi, which we'll talk about another time. Pausanias and Plutarch report a few different traditions of the Sibyl's parentage. She claims divine parentage, and you'll see there's some different gods that she might be attached to. And I should also say that these lines of Pausanias that I'm quoting, and again, all of my sources I'm going to put in the description down below. I'll put the English versions. These couple of lines might be corrupt, meaning there's some portion of the text that is missing or is unclear. I'm going to do my best here to go through. Right where he starts talking about the Sibyl, I think he's talking about two different people here, but I would be open to other interpretations. So he begins by saying that Delphi is the place where there first was a Sibyl, and then he's talking about a woman named Herophile, who I think is a second Sibyl. So she might be the successor of the first Sibyl, I'm not sure. She's still very ancient. Pausanias says that she allegedly predicted that Helen would be the cause of the Trojan War, so she's imagined to be from this mytho-historical time. And this is really just a way of saying we don't know, this priesthood is so old that we don't know where it comes from. So Pausanias says that Herophile wrote hymns to Apollo, wrote verses for Apollo, sometimes referring to herself as Artemis, the sister of Apollo, sometimes calling herself the wife or even the daughter of Apollo. She's really dedicated to this god, and she spends her time, you can imagine, sitting there, maybe plucking a lyre and singing songs, religious songs. One way or another, she found herself at the temple, and then ever since then, the temple had an element of prophecy in it. And then later the Pythia takes over that responsibility. And meanwhile, other Sibyls pop up at other temples, like Cumae, which is where I want to turn right now. Like we've said, the Sibyls were Greek priestesses originally. And the Sibyl of Cumae in Italy originates from a time where that part of Italy was colonized by Greece. So a lot of the culture in that area, even prior to Rome's arrival, was actually Greek. So she was there before the Romans ever were. But they made her the most famous Sibyl of them all, thanks to Virgil. But before we get to Virgil, a little bit more about Pausanias. Pausanias goes on from his description of the Delphic Sibyl to describe the Cumaean Sibyl, and he claims that she was the next person after Herophile at Delphi to give prophecies, and he writes her name as Demo. Pausanias says he's getting his information from a Cumaean historian named Hypericus, who claims that Demo is a native of the area of Cumae. And that's all we know about Demo. We don't have, certainly in our time, there's nothing of hers that is extant. But even in Pausanias' time, none of her oracles had survived or had been written down. But apparently the Cumaeans had a relic. They had a jar, and they claimed that inside the jar were her bones. When Aeneas meets the Sibyl, he's at a critical point in his flight from Troy. So the Trojan War happens, he's a native of Troy, he gets a bunch of Trojans and flees, and then they travel from Troy all the way to Italy, where they now are in Book 6. Aeneas has already gone through a tremendous amount of hardship between fleeing from the war and all of the horrors associated with that, being lost at sea and subject to the loss of crew members and storms and getting washed up on territories that it turns out are not very friendly. And recently he's just lost his father, so he's at a really critical point and a really low point when he meets the Sibyl. Aeneas doesn't really know what to do at this point, but between the dreams and the visions and then the recent appearance of his father's ghost, Aeneas knows that he has some kind of destiny to fulfill, although what it is he couldn't exactly tell you. So now is the point, this is the midpoint of the Aeneid, so he's going to find out what his destiny is right at this critical moment, right before the intermission, we'll say. At this point, Aeneas really could use some spiritual guidance, and so he seeks out the Sibyl of Cumae. Virgil actually gives a name for her, Deiphobe. And by the way, if you're interested in the etymology of her name, I'm going to link an article down below from 2011 where this exact topic is discussed. It's only a few pages long. The Sibyl is with Aeneas for the duration of Book 6. His preparations to go to the underworld, the journey itself, the catabasis, the long prophecy that he receives from his father Anchises about what he's supposed to do and what destiny he's supposed to fulfill, which, by the way, is the whole purpose of him going down there in the first place, and she's there with him when he returns. The parts that I want to focus on are where Aeneas actually talks to the Sibyl and interacts with her directly and then watches her at work. Aeneas' first interaction with the Sibyl moves very quickly. Aeneas shows up to her temple and is looking at all of the mythology that's depicted on the doors of the temple, and she shows up and immediately starts chastising him. This is not the time to be looking at pictures. Shouldn't you be sacrificing? And so from there it moves very quickly. Aeneas makes the appropriate sacrifice, and immediately after that the Sibyl begins to change. I'm going to read to you again from Lombardo's translation. The Sibyl says, "It is time to demand your destiny. The god, behold the god." And as she spoke there before the gates, her color changed. Her hair spread out into fiery points. She panted for air, and her breast heaved with feral madness. She was larger than life now, and her voice was no longer human as the god's power took possession of her. "You hesitate to pray? Hesitate, Aeneas of Troy? The great mouths of this thunderstruck hall will not open until you pray." And then after that, Aeneas does as he's told and prays to the god Apollo, and then we continue. Aeneas finished, but the priestess had not yet taken Apollo's bit into her mouth, and she convulsed like a Maenad, monstrous in the cave, desperate to shake the great god from her breast. All the more, though, he tired her rabid mouth, tamed her wild heart, and molded her to his will. And now the cave's 100 mouths opened of their own accord and transmitted the oracle's response through the empty air. "You have escaped the perils of the sea, but perils more grave await you on land. The Dardanians will enter Lavinium, be sure of that, but will wish they had never come. War! I see horrible war and the Tiber foaming with blood. You will have another Simois and Xanthus, another Doric camp. A second Achilles has been born in Latium to a goddess mother, and Juno will continue to afflict the Teucrians, while you, a suppliant, shall beg for help throughout Italy. And the cause for all this suffering for the Trojans shall be once more a foreign bride, an alien marriage. Do not yield, but oppose your troubles all the more boldly, as far as your fate and fortune allow. Salvation will come first from where you least expect it. A Greek city will open wide its gates." The Sibyl is essentially possessed by the god Apollo. She is truly just a vessel, a mouthpiece. She's described in wild and animalistic terms. There's a bit that Apollo is trying to put into her mouth as if she's a horse. She has a wild heart, a rabid mouth. She's convulsing like a Maenad. She's monstrous. She's no longer human. He says it explicitly. She is being possessed, and it is a physically traumatic experience, especially as you get later, and all literature gets more violent and gory. Lucan's description of this is pretty wild, and I recommend you reading it. But this is the price that the Sibyl pays for having access to knowledge the way that she does. Her prophecy, which is the first prophecy that Aeneas receives in Book 6, basically just outlines the rest of the plot of the Aeneid. and it all comes true in the context of the story. And after she delivers it, Aeneas asks her to accompany him to the underworld to meet with his father, and so that takes up the rest of the book. And he learns a lot about how the underworld works from her. There's a roughly contemporary account of Aeneas's meeting with the Sibyl that comes from Ovid's Metamorphoses, and I have David Rayburn's translation here. This is the one I've been using. I like it. I'll link it down below. And in the Metamorphoses, Ovid gives us a little bit more background on the Sibyl herself, the character of this Deiphobe, the specific Sibyl that Aeneas meets. He gives us an origin story for how she came to be the Sibyl, how she got her powers, and the price that she paid for it. It's worth reading the whole passage to you, so bear with me. Again, I'm reading from Rayburn's translation. So Ovid says, "When he'd passed this place to the right, and Parthenope's city of Naples, Aeneas arrived on the shores of the marshy region of Cumae, and entered the cave of the long-lived Sibyl. His prayer was to traverse the underworld kingdom, in order to visit the shade of his father. The prophetess held her gaze long fixed on the earth, till she raised her head as her soul was possessed by the god, and finally uttered in frenzy, 'You ask great things, you greatest of heroes, whose valor was proved by your sword in the fray, and whose love as a son and a father was tested by fire. But, noble Trojan, you need not be troubled. Your prayer shall be granted, and I shall guide you to Pluto's realm, where you'll see the Elysian fields and meet your father's dear spirit. No path is closed to the virtuous man.' So speaking, she showed him a golden bough which gleamed on a tree in Proserpina's forest, and told him to break it off from the trunk. Aeneas obeyed her, and so was allowed to descend and set eyes on the wealth of the awesome god of the dead, on his own forefathers, and lastly the ghost of aged Anchises, the great of heart, who taught him the laws which govern Avernus, and also the dangers facing his people in wars to come. Thence wearily climbing the uphill track to the earth, he lightened the tiring journey in talk with the Sibyl. And while he was plodding his fearful way through the murky twilight, he said to his guide from Cumae, 'You may be truly a goddess, or merely beloved of the gods, but by me you shall always be counted a spirit divine, and I shall owe it to your consent that I came to the land of the dead, and returned thence after I'd seen it. For these great mercies, when I'm restored to the air above, I shall build you a sacred temple, and pay you the tribute of incense.' The Sibyl turned to Aeneas, and heaving a deep sigh, said to him, 'Goddess I have never been. An immortal creature may not be accorded the tribute of holy incense. Yet ignorance must not lead you astray. Eternal life was there for the taking, if only I had offered my maidenhood up to the love of Apollo. But while he hoped that I'd yield and desired to seduce me with gifts, he said to me, Maiden of Cumae, now choose what you wish to be yours, and your wish shall be granted.' I showed him a pile of dust that I'd gathered, and foolishly asked for my birthdays to equal the number of sand grains, failing also to ask that those years should always be youthful. Yet Phoebus agreed and offered perpetual youth as well, if I'd let him enjoy my body. I spurned his gift, and remained forever a virgin unwedded. But now the joy of my springtime is past, and weak old age with its trembling gait is upon me, age to be long endured. I have lived 700 years, but still have to see 300 harvests and seasons of vintage to equal the number of grains in the pile. The time will arrive when the length of days shall shrink my body from all it's been to a tiny frame, and my age-worn limbs be reduced to the weight of a feather. Then no one will ever believe that I was once adored and desired by a god. Yet even Phoebus may fail to recall me, or else he'll deny that he loved me. So changed, so invisible. Yet the fates will leave me my voice, the voice by which men will know me." So Ovid gives us more background on the Sibyl herself and her interaction with the god Apollo. Like I was talking about before, she has to pay a price for the gifts that she's given by the gods. Usually there's a trade-off. In her case, she was kind of tricked, even though Apollo was willing to grant her anything that she wanted, and he even offered a suggestion to make her request a little bit better for her. But it came with a price, and she wasn't willing to pay that price. So she has this eternal connection to the god, even though she rejected his advances. And she also has this extra long life. She's already lived 700 years, and she has to live 300 more as a result of this quasi-curse from the god Apollo. But that whole time she'll be able to practice prophecy. Even when her body withers away, she'll still be able to use her voice. And that was sort of what I was talking about before. The identity of the Sibyl herself matters less than the work that she's doing. She's a vessel for the gods, so it doesn't really matter so much her own personhood. And that's why even after her body will fade, her voice will remain. So we have two versions of Aeneas's interaction with the Sibyl. Like I said, Aeneas is at a critical point in his journey. He's seeking out the Sibyl right as he finally sets foot in mainland Italy, which is his final destination. He's not in the right part of Italy yet, but he's reached, the landmass that he's looking for after wandering for so long at sea. His conversations with her and the journey that they take together is kind of like the last step in Aeneas's initiation, right before he actually starts to carry out his destiny, now that he knows what he's supposed to do. Everything up until this point has been getting him to that place, and the Sibyl is this last advisory figure that helps him out. So we'll leave Aeneas there for now. According to legend, the Cumaean Sibyl is also responsible for the acquisition by Roman officials, by the Roman administration, the acquisition of these books of prophecy known as the Sibylline Books. These were collections of oracular sayings, ostensibly by Sibyls, that were put together into these volumes that at one point or another came into Rome's possession. This is not to be confused with the Sibylline Oracles, which is a separate collection of books. They're influenced by Judaism and Christianity. That's a different thing than what I'm talking about. Those books are extant. We have them, or we have at least some portion of them. Whereas the Sibylline books, the ones from the Sibyls, the ones that the Sibyls gave to the last king of Rome, those we don't have, unfortunately. But those are the ones that I'm going to be talking about. The Sibylline Oracles or the pseudo-Sibylline Oracles, that's a different thing. So the legend of how Rome comes into possession of the Sibylline books goes like this. The Sibyl of Cumae approached King Tarquinius Superbus. This was back when Rome had kings prior to the Republic. Tarquinius Superbus is the last king of Rome. She approached him and she said, "I have 9 books of prophecy to sell you for this price." Tarquinius refused to buy them. He said the price was too high, so she went away and she burned 3 of the books. She came back to him with 6 books of prophecy for the same price, and Tarquin again refused to purchase the books. So she went away and she burned 3 more of these books. She approached Tarquin again for the 3rd time and said, "I have 3 books of prophecy for the same price, the original price that she had told him for the 9 books. And Tarquin said, "I should probably ask someone about this." So he consulted with his augurs, and they were horrified to find out that 6 of the books had been burned, and they begged him to pay whatever the cost was to get these last 3 books. And so that's what he did. He paid the price of 9 to only get 3. And so Rome gets its hands on these books. During the Republic, these books were kept in the Temple of Jupiter in the Roman Forum, and they were guarded by a select group of priests. The contents of the books are largely unknown. These would have been secret tomes that were only consulted by the select group of priests and only on occasions of great need. But we know at least that they were supposedly collections of oracular sayings. And the way that they were used was not so much to look for a specific answer to a specific question. They were consulted as part of the response to things like natural disasters, for example, or attacks on the city. The idea was that the books would be able to tell them the kind of expiatory rituals that they need to do in order to remedy whatever the problem is. So if there's a drought or a famine, you consult the books, and then the books tell you, in the case of this happening, all things considered, this is what you should do to make the drought or the famine go away. The temple where the books were held was burned down in 83 BCE, towards the end of the Republic, and the books were lost with it. Over time, the temple was rebuilt, and new books were sought out by Rome to replace what they had lost. They were gathered from around the Mediterranean, and they were verified by experts to make sure that they were true books of prophecy, and then those were subsequently used in the same way that the original collection had been. And so the books continued to be consulted and used throughout Rome's history all the way until the 4th century CE, when they were once again burned, likely due to the spread and wide adoption of Christianity in the empire. It's unclear when the Sibyls themselves ended their practice. Unlike other elements of Roman paganism, the Sibyls had some claim to legitimacy under Christianity due to a kind of unusual interpretation of a poem by Virgil. In his 4th eclogue, this is a collection of shorter poems, Virgil reports this prediction by the Cumaean Sibyl that he says was made long ago, but now is coming true. Namely, the arrival of a young boy who will carry on the work of his divine father and bring peace to the known world. If you're an early Christian, you might read this as a prediction of the coming of Jesus Christ. And this is written right around the same time as the dates for the historical Jesus Christ. More likely, this is a fawning praise poem for Augustus, who carried on the work of Julius Caesar, his adopted father, claimed divine lineage by deifying Julius Caesar, and settled generations of civil war to bring peace to a very unstable empire. So here's a few lines from it. I'm reading from the website Poetry in Translation, which I will link down below. Virgil writes, "Now the last age of the Cumaean prophecy begins. The great roll call of the centuries is born anew. Only favor the child who's born, pure Lucina," that's a childbirth goddess, "under whom the first race of iron shall end, and a golden race rise up throughout the world. Now your Apollo reigns. He will take on divine life, and he will see gods mingled with heroes, and be seen by them, and rule a peaceful world with his father's powers." You can see how easily a Christian interpretation of these lines could come to be. You can also see the interplay between religion and politics, which was a feature of Roman life from the very beginning. The Sibyls and others who dealt in prophecy were treated with a degree of reverence by the population, a reverence that could be manipulated and used to great effect in the political sphere, which is exactly what Virgil was doing when he was writing this poem to Augustus. Although they were reclusive and mysterious, the Sibyls served an important function in Greek and Roman society, voicing the opinions of the gods and supplying otherwise unknown superhuman knowledge. The oracles were opaque and confusing, like all divine speech is, because it doesn't translate well to human ears. The prophetic voice in Harry Potter inherits the Sibyl's name, right? Sibyl Trelawney is this strange creature whose waking predictions are almost always wrong, but on several occasions she delivers a true and terrifying prophecy that she has no recollection of. In these moments, she is possessed by, it doesn't say what, that wouldn't work with the world building, but she is possessed by something, and she doesn't remember it, and she's speaking in a voice that is not her voice. The form of her prophecy, the true prophecy, mirrors what was happening with her namesakes. Something beyond takes over and speaks through her as if she is a vessel. And like most ancient prophets, she's a little bit strange, a little bit abnormal. And although anytime she tries to predict on command, she fails miserably, nevertheless, her actual prophecies, the moments where she's speaking out of body, those always come true. So in the end, the Sibyls' power comes from their position as a mouthpiece, and they themselves know that their legacy will be the survival of their ethereal voice. Their bodies might die, but the immortal words of the gods will remain. I'll end with a quote from Plutarch, reporting what the Sibyl supposedly first sang about her own legacy. "For when we halted as we reached a point opposite the rock which lies over against the council chamber, upon which it is said that the first Sibyl sat after her arrival from Helicon, where she had been reared by the Muses, though others say she came from the Malians and was the daughter of Lamia, whose father was Poseidon. Serapion recalled the verses in which she sang of herself, that even after death she shall not cease from prophesying, but that she shall go round and round the moon, becoming what is called the face that appears on the moon, while her spirit, mingled with the air, shall be forever borne onward in the voices of presage and portent. And since from her body, transformed within the earth, grass and herbage shall spring, on this shall pasture the creatures reared for the holy sacrifice, and they shall acquire all manner of colors and forms and qualities upon their inward parts, from which shall come for men prognostications of the future." Thanks so much for watching. If you liked this video, you can let me know by leaving a thumbs up down below. And if you want to see more content on the beliefs of ancient Greece and Rome, feel free to subscribe. As always, I'll see you in the comments down below. I'm especially curious to hear what forms of divination, if any, you use in your practice. We'll be covering more requested topics in the upcoming videos, so stay tuned for those. Thanks again for watching, I truly appreciate you, and I'll see you next time.